Well, as the seals of this mysterious scroll begin to open, we are introduced to this now infamous image of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And in every, Hollywood apocalyptic movie you've seen, these horsemen play a role. Whether they're some mystical, satanic being or they're actual people that people try to say, like, oh, these are the four horsemen now. Well, lo and behold, we're going to look at this more symbolically and figure out what do these mean in the broader context of the Old Testament with the prophets and in the book of Revelation, because there's some really powerful images here going on. But I think that Hollywood gets it wrong. Revelation 6, 1-8. Then I looked on as the Lamb opened one of the seven seals. I heard one of the four living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." So I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider held a bow and was given a crown, and he went forth from victory to victory. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Out came another horse, fiery red. Its rider was allowed to take peace from the earth so that the people would kill each other. He was given a large sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the living creature say, "Come." So I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a balance for weighing in his hand. I heard what sounded like a voice from among the four living creatures. It said, "A quart of wheat for a denarian, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarian, but don't damage the olive oil in the wine." When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice from the fourth living creature say, "Come." So I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and the grave was following right behind. They were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, disease, and the wild animals of the earth. Okay, so we're jumping into the opening of the seals. And this is these famous horsemen that are in almost every apocalyptic Hollywood movie, right? You got the white horse and the red horse and the black horse and then the pale green horse of death. And I read these more symbolically. I don't think we're looking for some actual horsemen like in, again, some of those Hollywood movies. And there's reason for that, because this is not a new image. John is not pulling this out of thin air. This actually connects with so many Old Testament prophecies. In particular, Zechariah, I'm going to focus in on those, but I'm going to list several in the show notes that you could pull together. Really what's being shown here is this pretty intense scene of judgment, but it's coming through the images of war and famine. These are the sorts of things that people would experience in any kind of war zone, of kind of intense battle and death. This right here, interesting to maybe sit on for a little bit. The quart of wheat for a denarian and 3 quarts of barley for a denarian. That's like the basic sustenance of bread alone, bread and barley. A quart of wheat and 3 quarts of barley is pretty much what you would need for a day to survive, just to bare subsistence. And here a denarian is a typical day's wages. So I looked this up, and it's based on ancient Roman cost. This is like 8 times more than what's normal. And really, you're basically saying you're earning just enough to survive. So that's what happens, and again, that often happens during war. But all of these things. So what's going on here? The horsemen, and to look this up would be in Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 6 is where these horsemen first appear. And that image, along with what they actually bring, the pestilence and the sword and the famine, shows up again and again in Old Testament prophecies. It's interesting to note the four horsemen, and they stand in kind of connection with the four winds. So this idea that they're the 4 compass points of the earth, there's these 4 angels of destruction kind of being held back for a time. But at some point, God's going to release them, and they're going to bring this judgment upon the earth. These stand, I think, in contrast with the 4 creatures right here, 4 living creatures. If you remember back in chapter 4, these creatures, it's an image of all of creation in worship around the throne. And so there's this image from worship to destruction over here. this is pulling from Zechariah again, but one of the key things that I think is happening here is God does allow for and use human governments, people, armies for his purposes. Throughout the Old Testament, we don't have time to get into all of this, but you can look through all of these references. Two main things happen when nations go to war in terms of our theology and what God is up to. So one, he unleashes war upon the earth as an act of judgment against the wicked nations. In Zechariah especially, there's this great line where God says, I was just a little bit angry, but these nations, they took it so far. They took God had established them as his authority, as his instrument, and yes, they were supposed to enact justice, but they overstepped their bounds. And now God is taking a stand. He is taking responsibility for these nations that he established, and yet they took it out of control. And so he's coming with judgment against the nations. But even God's people don't escape this kind of calamity. Sadly, this is uncomfortable for us. But when God's people, and especially through the Old Testament, actually the very next verse, we're going to look at this next week, verse 9 talks about the saints who are killed during this endeavor. And so these horsemen, their death and destruction comes as judgment against the wicked, but also as purification for God's people. So judgment against the wicked and purification for God's people. That's a big theme to unpack, but just kind of sit on that for a little bit. Somehow, and again, look through all of the references in the show notes, but this idea that sometimes war and famine and destruction is actually a way of purification. God actually warns his people, when you rebel against me, I'm going to send these things on you. All of these things, these images show up again and again from Deuteronomy all the way through. And when it happens to God's people, they see it as an act of purification. There's something that they're going through this. Ultimately, the hope is that they come to their senses, they repent, and they're purified. They come back into relationship with God. For the wicked nations who are bringing so much sin and destruction and evil in the world, it's an act of justice. God does not let the suffering go unanswered. At some point, even though it looks like he may be far away and distant, he is holding these back out of his mercy, and yet at some point he unleashes the four winds, the four horsemen, and so it kind of they go hand in hand. These horsemen bring both judgment on the wicked and purification for God's people.